Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest. Well, Slava, we're Baal again.
We are ball to the wall in the Middle East right now.
We are. Enduring some sweltering heat, festering bugs, and left for dead side quests.
This is all very apt descriptions of where we're at.
Mm-hmm. Any fun highlights from your week?
Oh, yes.
Or do you want me to ask more of my silly questions?
Ask a silly question, because the highlights are not that high.
You read books to get away from the real world?
Yes.
Nice. Well, how about this then? What's the best Wi-Fi name you've ever seen?
FBI monitoring van.
Yeah, that one's good.
Because I have one in my neighborhood.
Yeah, that's not the van. I'm going to let you know that.
I had one silly one named after like a Waffle House marquee. Not the Waffle House, but a restaurant like Waffle House. It was in Chicago when I lived there. And one of their breakfast entrees was called the Chunky Monkey.
Mm.
My whole time in Chicago, my Wi-Fi name was the Chunky Monkey.
Nice.
I just thought it was silly, but people thought it was hilarious when they came over.
I'll do most things for a quick laugh. Naming my Wi-Fi weird stuff, not one of those things. But, because I've been thinking about it this week, here are some other funny Wi-Fi names that you all can use if you're resetting your router. Hogwarts Great Hall Wi-Fi, Wu-Tang LAN, Abraham Linksys, definitely not Wi-Fi, pretty fly for a Wi-Fi, password is password, your favorite surveillance fan, Wi-Fi Art Thou Romeo, Go-Go Router Rangers, Trojan Virus, I like that one, Get Off My LAN. Anyway, little humor to lighten your load from the long week.
Yeah, well, a little lightening of the load is something that I need. It's been a very busy few weeks at work, and then this godforsaken podcast has taken 3 recordings to get done.
That's true.
Because of Wi-Fi issues.
Because it's,
See
yeah,
how it
because
all
of Wi-Fi.
comes together? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, what the audience doesn't know is this is day 2, take 5, actually, of trying to do part 2 of Baal, because Slava's router was possessed.
By Baal.
By Baal, yeah. And wouldn't work, and schedules, tried again, wouldn't work, couldn't fix it, wouldn't work. Here we are, though. I think this one's the ticket.
All computers, routers, browsers, caches have been reset, cleared, rebooted. So hopefully this will be our last take on Baal before Zuber comes back.
Before Zuber, I was going to say, we're doing one more episode in case you forgot. In case your memory has also been wiped and not just your cache.
It could be both.
It could be both. Well, let's move back to the deserts of Kuwait. But before we do, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a side quest.
We're covering Baal by Robert MacCammon. This book is about a waitress who's married to a loser, dropout English major who drives a cab. She's attacked and assaulted in New York City. There's a pregnancy resulting from that attack, and there's something strange about the child who drives both parents equally mad in different ways. And then when he's put into an orphanage, he wreaks havoc there. As he grows up and gathers followers around himself, he begins to take over parts of the world. Seen by many as a messiah who flock to him, we find him in Kuwait, gathering to himself hordes and hordes of people, including children. And we left you with a scene where a professor going to cover Messiah figures in the Middle East, thinking this is all cool and fun, is pulled into a violent orgy during which he goes into a trance and kills a child. And we pick up this week where his advisor, another professor named Verga, sets out to rescue him. And we are in Kuwait.
Yes. Now, I know that you started with these stories about a waitress, but she's simply the conduit. If I can cheekily say, she's just a vessel.
That's literally that.
For this book. Right, exactly. We see the parents for, 2 chapters? 4 chapters, maybe? And then they just don't exist anymore.
3 chapters, I think.
3? Yeah. It's not very many. I understand that that's what the summary says, but I just don't agree with it. As a reader of the book.
That's fair, because she is a vessel. That's all that happens. We're introduced to her. We're introduced to her loser husband, who's some rich kid who decides that he's going to marry her because she's cute.
Tell his parents to kick rocks.
Only because she's cute. Tells his parents to kick rocks, like you said, and then realizes he doesn't love her. And then she's assaulted. And then there's this pregnancy, which is Baal, the reincarnation of the ancient Near Eastern demon. She kills him. The mother kills the husband. And then apparently she goes to jail, and he's in an orphanage. So...
And I think I said this last time, but I really think that the order that we figure the story out and that it's shared with us should have been different, because it's not really about the parents, but how you start things stick out to you in books.
Yeah.
Right? Where I really think we should have started with Baal in the orphanage. It's like, this kid is being weird. He's not going by his real name. And then before he burns them in a room, cut, right? Give me half of the school story when one of the nuns is like, yeah, well, you know what happened in his past. And then it's chapter stops or whatever, right? And then we start with what we see as the beginning of the book now, where it's his mother, his father, she was assaulted, and a pregnancy resulted. Then we're like, oh, well, this kid comes from trauma. And then cut back to, maybe the orphanage, and then he's building this little group of kids, right? And then it cuts back for that last scene where he's like, don't call me, call me Baal, or whatever. Whatever that scene was just before the husband died.
Yeah. When the husband died, he was not old enough to talk.
Right, but he had those beady little eyes or whatever.
Yeah.
And just cut back to that scene, and you're like, wait a minute. That feels like it could have taken this book to the next level, almost, at least for the first half. We can move into the second half here in a second, but
it picks up in the second half where Michael, he's supposedly an archetype for Michael the Archangel, like a literary archetype or an allegory to him or an allusion to him, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't get enough of Michael's backstory, and I understand that, yeah, he's a mysterious figure and we're not supposed to, but give me a scene of Michael first meeting Baal. Maybe it's in an orphanage. Maybe it's when Baal was first building his little army of demon lovers. Michael doesn't have his motivations fleshed out well. And that's one thing I wanted to talk about that I didn't like about the book. The motivations for Michael are not fleshed out. The motivations for Verga are not fleshed out well, because Verga's this unwilling, unlikely hero, because he's old, he's weak, he's ravaged with guilt about his wife, he's lonely. I think there's even parts of the book where we get the internal dialogue of Verga, and he's almost jealous of some of the younger professors, and he kind of hates his job because he has to fire or push out of the teaching circuit the old professors who are getting senile, and he realizes he's going to become one of them, and he hasn't done anything that extraordinary with his teaching career. So that's about 7 setups and 7 motivations for him to go fight Baal, but they're never fleshed out. We get one reason because his understudy, for lack of a better word, or his advisee, he's advising in this project. Right. He really likes him and likes his wife, and I guess they're kind of like surrogate children to him or something. And so to go rescue him, to go find out, that seems like a good enough reason. But then he decides to fight Baal for what? For revenge? We get reasons for it. I'm not unsatisfied to such a degree where I think, okay, well, this is a complete misstep by
Hogwash.
or hogwash. I was going to say a complete misstep by McCammon. There's just not enough meat on that bone.
Yeah, I realized Michael was some sort of like archangel character when we got to the North Pole, which I guess I'll back up here for a second. That was difficult for me.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
we're in Kuwait and we jump to the North Pole, and I'm like, wait, when did we get on the Polar Express? Was what I was thinking. Is Baal the conductor, and we're all just kind of like choo choo here, going to see Saint Nick? That was jarring to the point where I was like, I don't know about this book anymore. Like, not in like a bad way, well, not in a good way either, but in a jarring way.
Yeah, I get it. Same thing for me, same principle. When I look at Verga, I understand the reasons that he goes to Kuwait. I understand his hatred or his zeal to fight Baal. It's not fleshed out well, and you're left with lukewarm soup. Soup is delicious. The bread was great. Whatever silly analogy, right? Same thing here. Give me more of Baal and Michael's backstory. One paragraph would have been enough. McCammon has proven himself with his first book at 25 to be an amazing wordsmith.
Oh, 100%.
But give me more in these moments where a sentence or two, a paragraph, if we get a flashback of Michael first meeting Baal or Michael first setting out to fight Baal, and we have more than just the mystery of this guy who might be an angel in a book that's really not that religious overtly.
Mm-hmm.
And the second and third time jumps,
Just the third for me.
or location jump.
Yeah.
Yeah, the location jump, actually, not the time. The time jump is fine because she's assaulted, she gives birth, kids in the orphanage, kids in Kuwait. Those are fine, the time jumps.
Yeah, no problem with those. Thought they were a good use of plot device.
Right, because what else are you going to do with a 300-page popular horror book? But the location jumps, especially from Kuwait to Iceland, and you're like, what? What?
Yeah.
The first time that happened and the second time I reread it, I'm like, this is, I don't know how to say it. Like, I don't want to say a bit much.
But it was. Even knowing that McCammon has a quote where he's like, they say write what you know, I wanted to write what I didn't know. Oh, okay, cool. Baal, Kuwait, like, okay, all right, cool, yeah. The North Pole, okay. Especially when you're trying to land the plane that is the plot, you don't introduce new elements. And I think that maybe that's what we're trying to get at here while we're kind of verbally processing is you don't introduce new elements. Michael was new, too. Yeah, I know he was there in Kuwait, right? But he just shows up. Someone at Baal's status makes some enemies along the way. Believable. Fine. But to your point, it's like, well, but why does he care?
Right, and Michael's knowledge of Baal is fairly extensive, at least compared to Zark and Verga and Naughton. Why does he know so much about Baal? That's maybe a more precise critique that I can offer. And that question would be answered by my suggestion. Give me a paragraph of when Michael and Baal first meet, or what is the impetus for Michael being so driven to get Baal? And then, how the hell does he know Baal is going to the North Pole?
Oh, good point. I didn't ask that question.
They Jedi mind trick a Jewish guy to kill Baal to stir the fervor of the Middle East to destroy Israel. And then they're like, all right, we got the Jew patsy to kill, but not really kill Baal, because it was actually a body double that was burned. And we're going to go to Iceland now. You're like, oh, well, okay, Iceland. Your most fervent followers are here in the Middle East. You have stoked the fires of anti-Semitism because you're Baal, you hate Yahweh, and you hate Israel, and you've come back to unleash hell on them. That's another subplot that's not really explored. And then you go to Iceland.
Yeah.
Those are just little things that once you read the book a second time, you're forced to discuss it. You're like, wait a minute. I enjoyed the hell out of this, but there's about 3 or 4 things that are a slip of the fingers you're playing the piano, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think when you pay more attention to it than just, reading it, this is where the plot's going, whatever, you're like, wait, because then you start asking questions, like I always do. But to your point, this is pop horror, in my opinion. This is not,
yeah, absolutely.
It, right, by King. So as much as we want more, And I love that this is influencing you. The podcast is influencing you.
It is.
That's fun. That's fun for me. Might not be fun for you, but it is fun for me.
It's kind of like Venom.
I'm the symbiote. Is that what you're saying?
For lack of a better term, I was going to say your view of books. That's the symbiote.
Okay. Great. Love that. For me, I think. Maybe.
I don't know.
Let's side quest on this for a second. Like, have you noticed what it is? Is it literally just the frequency in which we do the podcast that's making you start to think about the plots that we enjoy? Because, look, it's still a fun book. Like, yeah, we've got our complaints, but it's still a fun book that are making you go, well, this could have been better. Is it just the frequency that we podcast that's making you start thinking that? I know we're developing more depth in how, and this is like offline stuff that we're working on to make the podcast better, of talking about plot device, character motivations, character development, and the elements of story. Is it that's kind of driving you to go, well, I think this could have been better? Or is it simply the time that we spend podcasting, which is minimum once a week, or a combination, something else?
I think it's a combination, but like 90-10, right?
Okay.
It's 90% of reading books with a specific purpose to talk about them on the podcast.
Okay. Yep.
And then our conversation. So maybe it's like 70, 20, 10, right? So 70% of that, 20% of the conversations where some of the stuff wears off on me.
Sure.
Because that's the way this works. And then 10% the repetition, because you do a thing over and over again. And things are repeated. Obviously, things are going to stick in your head, or things are going to become a habit. So I would say a combination, but really just 70% of it is just maturing as a podcaster. So I have to read a book. Our podcast is reading books and discussing them. If this was talking about movies or teaching people how to fix things around the house podcast, I would grow in my explaining how to measure a beam correctly, because we're talking about books. Me maturing as a podcast, that's the nucleus of it, is the book part. So now that I've read so many books and I've talked about them so many times with you, I'm now seeing gaps in stories that would help the story be better, that would help me understand the motivation of characters. So if we're going to use this specific book as an example, other gaps that would make the story fuller, where I will understand not only the motivation for Michael trying to get Baal, but it would help me understand the story fuller, because then, Baal is connected to Michael because of this thing that's happened there in Ohio, as an example. And Virga and Naughton are connected because, not only because of that one scene in The Office where I get a glimpse of Virga's affection for Naughton and his wife, but there's something else that's going to brew in the background, some kind of project that connects them and makes them partners and, gives them some, brotherly love for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And listen, pop horror, it can't turn into 10,000 pages like it did with it. But I firmly believe, because I now have read so many freaking books, including for this podcast, I firmly believe that doesn't need to be accomplished in a King manner or in King fashion with 47 pages. It can be accomplished in 47 sentences maybe, or half a page, or 3 sentences. For a guy like McCammon, he can do it in half a paragraph.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if authors back in the day were more, thorough is not the right word, but it's the word that I'm coming up with, more detailed with what they wanted their story to say.
Yeah.
And because we have a lot more pop fiction today, whether it's pop horror or pop fiction like Star Wars, where there's just these fast-paced action books where it's like, well, it means whatever it means for the story. And then, we dialogue about Bane take over Xana's body. And then the author is like, well, I thought I was pretty clear. It goes back to the plot device he used, and we're like, nope, not clear at all. And then we have something like this where McCammon's like, and then they went to the North Pole, and you're like, did you do drugs before you wrote this? Like, what does that have to do with like this Messiah creature person? I think it's a fun moment when he, get in the coffin, throws him in the water, it comes back
Yeah,
up, he flies out like a demon out of hell,
literally.
and literally, it's like that's a fun moment, but like it needs to be a bit of a longer book to get there, where it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like jarring.
Right, and then Zark. I love Zark, the Russian shaman,
Yeah, I'm not a shaman is a shaman,
half Eskimo, half Russian.
as
It's
one does.
as one does. But the funny thing is, Russians are so racist. At least a portion of the Russian population is so racist against Eskimos. Like American views of Polish people back in the day, right? If you're called a Polak, it means you're dumb. Well, it's kind of the equivalent of that for Russians or the Eskimos. So I have no idea, but a half Eskimo, half Russian shaman living in Iceland. It's fun. I think it's
Yeah,
fun. But just like with Michael, here we are with Zark. And listen, the setup is fine. They meet Zark because he's the only one who knows the terrain past the point of no return where nobody else will take this group of, wannabe assassins. And so obviously we need a character like Zark. And we get all the right things and the right setup for Zark, but give
yeah,
me something else. Give me some obstacle between us and Zark. But that has to start in Kuwait, where they're like, wait,
right.
they're going to Iceland? How are they going to Iceland? Why?
Why are they going to Iceland? How do
Yeah,
they know to go to Iceland?
right. How does Michael know? We could have Zark, not a shaman. We can have Zark just as a Russian renegade doing something, whatever it is he's doing in Kuwait, whatever Russians do in Kuwait when they go rogue. That's a little bit more than you probably asked for, but it's a combination of a lot of things.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that you can still have a good book and go, hey, it could have been better. And it doesn't take away from the joy of the book, right? Like, similar to, at least for me, similar to how you're like, tell me the future plot point, moments, because I want to know. And I'm like, well, it's more fun when you experience the surprise. And you're like, it doesn't matter to me. I'm still going to be surprised. To me, when you're critical with a book and you go, hey, this could have been better. Now, look, and we say this a bunch, but this guy published a book. It's his first book, and it's real, real good. So all these are just like, hey, it could have been better.
I read different reviews of this book a while back when I first read this book, and I was preparing to talk about it in the podcast because I imagined we ultimately would. And now I can't with confidence say where I got this, but I do remember reading reviews from reviewers of books and bloggers that have mentioned without any citation, that's why I'm not confident about this, but have
Mm-hmm.
mentioned without any citation that later on McCammon grew to not like this book as much because he thought it was weak.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he sees his growth as an author,
Yeah.
and he looks back and says, well, I'm putting words in his mouth, but even though it was the best I could do at the time, it's still objectively not a great book.
Yeah. He said something like that based on secondary sources.
Yeah. That's really good. You want to keep moving on here? Discussing of the plot? Any more notable things on the negative side?
No, those are the ones that stood out to me. Everything else seemed really good. I liked specifically the inner dialogue. The pacing was still
Mhm.
good, except for the
Yeah.
freaking geography jumps.
Right.
But the pacing is great for the same reason that you mentioned a few minutes ago. It's pop. We don't need 17 chapters on the mother and the father, whatever their names are. I forget.
Doesn't even matter.
At this point, it doesn't matter, but I forget for the time being. We don't need 17 chapters on them just deteriorating, like their marriage falling apart. We get it. They're already have started on bad footing, and
Right.
they have a kid that's a demon. That's it. Like, shit's
Well,
going to
and I
happen.
thought that vignette, like, I was kind of hoping we were going to get some more vignettes. Just like vignette here of this guy rising to power.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah.
I thought that was what was coming for us. And it, like, starts off, it ramps real well. But then I kind of felt like it plateaued.
Yeah, it did ramp up at plateau. That's actually an apt way of putting it. There's a lot going on. It's going, and then you're like, oh, nothing's
Well,
happening.
And I'd say that that's what draws us in. right? We're like, oh, all right, we're moving. We're okay. We're doing this. Like, she gets attacked. Skip ahead. 2 years old, which is like love a fast pacing. Now that said, you can't just fast pace the entire time. You do need lulls, which I felt like we got when he was in the orphanage, and then it kind of felt like it was gonna snap up again when he's in Kuwait, and we're following a different character, and then I'm really jarred by going to the North Pole. I'm really jarred by this big incident that happens in Kuwait where metaphorically, a bomb went off. Like
Yeah.
all this stuff happens and it was confusing. Like it wasn't clear enough.
Now that you mentioned that, what happened with Naughton? So Naughton is in this orgy. He's banging away, and he comes to because he's in a trance, and he has slit the throat of a child that's chained to a pole. So this is dark, dark scene. It's a very horrific scene that McCammon has painted.
Mm-hmm.
It ends abruptly. The way it ends, the way that section of the book ends is masterfully done. Masterfully. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, all right, Naughton is giving himself over to Baal. The next time we hear about Naughton, he is a decaying corpse, mumbling incoherent nonsense, dying on the floor of the room where he supposedly was writing the manuscript of Baal's life. And you're like, what the shit happened? Like, give me okay. Like, we get the scene of an orgy and a kid getting his throat slit. Give me a scene of Naughton, like, coming apart at, the seams, or Baal messing with his head.
Yeah, it's almost as if McCammon had really great plot points, and it was the connection between them that was immature in his writing capacity, right? Where it's like the plot points are, okay, we see Naughton giving himself over, and then, like you said, we don't see him again. To a point I brought up earlier, you can't introduce new things at the end of the book. That's just not good writing. Yeah. Unless it's a trilogy or something, and it's like, oh, hey, read next time to find out what happens with Michael, right? And his nemesis Baal, right?
Yeah.
Baal to Electric Boogaloo, right? Like something.
Ball to the wall.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to go on a side quest. As I perused other McCammon books this morning, I was just like, what else has he written that I might be interested in reading? Because it's only been this book, and I put a book that got really great reviews on Audible into my wish list, but I'd never even looked at what the hell the overview or the plot summary of it was. Doing a little bit more of research this morning, he has an interesting book. It's called Usher's Passing, and it's supposedly the surviving member of the House of Usher from Poe's story. It's his journey to find out more about his family. This just came to me, an impromptu side quest. If this book was written from the perspective of a professor, Verga, Schmerga, Naughton, whatever, writing about how two professors got involved with fighting Baal, and we get the histories and the vignettes and everything, but it's written as a professor who's reflecting what happened 50 years ago and how the school was embroiled with this. That could have given chances, like stepping stones, for McCammon to explore more of the backstory, more of the meat and the bones. What would you say?
I think it could work. I'm just realizing something. To take a different side quest and tie it in with yours, with the rise of AI happening, what would it be like if you could duplicate yourself as a writer? So McCammon can put all of his books, all of his manuscripts into an AI and go, hey, this is how I write. We're going to write this way. And then he says, I want to rewrite Baal. Boom, spits out a manuscript. But now it's using his more educated, more mature writing style. And he can say, I want to change these couple plot points, and then boom, pumps it out. I wonder if authors will do that to try to spit out books faster. I'm realizing this didn't really actually tie into what you were saying.
Not in our lifetime, I don't think.
Are you kidding me? Like, AI's all over the place.
But listen, here's my reasoning for saying that. Unless something happens that transforms culture completely, I don't see that happening because authors and actors and well-known creators have spoken out against AI. Not in any sense we're like, oh, bad AI, shut it down, but they think the use of AI in production of art or literature is a bad thing. So if authors start doing it now, let's say in our lifetime, it won't be the caliber of McCammons or Kings or Daniel Steele, who's written 50 million books, I think. They won't be practicing this. But I do think eventually, as AI becomes more prevalent, not just a cool thing that everybody's playing with, but a thing that's enmeshed into society more, like smartphones are now, or something like that. In that sense, where it is necessary to function in our society using AI, then yeah, then that will happen, I think. And maybe that will happen in our lifetimes. Maybe I'm being too conservative in my
Well,
guesstimate.
I think that you make a strong point. My only rebuttal would be is who owns the rights is really what this comes down to, I think. Because if you're using all of your source material as yourself, so
Yeah,
McCammon, gets Chat GPT plus, he spins up his own thing, he puts all of his manuscripts in, and he's like, I'm writing a new book and I'm using this to do it. And now it's a tool, but he's still the author.
no, that's a good rebuttal. Yeah, that's good.
That's why I think that it could happen in our lifetime if you own the rights to it. But yeah, really interesting things to talk about and think about. I will repent. Let's go back to the book and go back to what you said and then work our way back out of this rabbit hole.
What I said was he wrote a book that explores what would happen to the House of Usher if one of the kids survived, an unknown kid, and started tracing back his lineage and his family history. And the thought that popped into my head as we were talking, what if this book was written from a research perspective? Because the main characters, protagonists, are professors. So that's where I ended, and then we went on our little side quest.
So I would say to answer your original question, yes, I do think that that would be one way that the story could have been matured and add a new and unique layer to it.
Yeah. But ice layers aside, let's keep
Ice
moving
layers
north.
aside, let's keep moving north.
Yes. I think
The good things.
the good things, the introduction to Zark and him being a weirdo, really. He's a weird guy, but he's a cool weird guy. He's not like a buffoon.
Right, right.
But he has these quirks that are you're just like, okay, Zark, calm down. And he's this grizzled, old, Icelandic, Russian hunter who's also a half Eskimo. So he's very unique. I really like Zark. And I think the ending, I'm torn about the ending, right?
I find that surprising, but okay.
Okay. Why do you find it surprising? Then I'll tell you why if I am torn with the ending.
The reason I find it surprising is you usually like books that have endings that are obscure and abrupt and non bow tie resolution style endings. So you saying you don't really like it is interesting to me. It catches my attention based on what I know about your preferences in books.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair point. So I like the ending overall. I really do. And I do like the obscure and abrupt endings and endings that leave you hanging for the sake of like, oh, what could happen? You get to use your own imagination. But there's also something missing, and I can't quite put my finger on it. The other stuff I could, like the motivation for the characters, the jumps and locations, those I'm confident. This is what I don't like. Here it's hard to pinpoint. And the best thing I can do is give you somewhat of a silly analogy. Let's say McCammon's writings are a grocery store, a fancy grocery store. This aisle, this book, there's just items missing. It's poorly stocked. Not to the extent where you can't find anything, because we still enjoy the book, if we're going to continue this analogy. But when it gets to the ending, something's doesn't feel right. And it could be because it was such a fantastic fight, and then boom, it ends. But I don't think so. I think there's something more, and I feel it could have been more meat on the bone. Again, I don't know what's the food analogies today, but well, let me recap. Let's recap, and maybe you can either convince me otherwise or agree with me. So there's this cataclysmic fight. Zark is dead. Michael is okay, but crawling around somewhere. And then Verga's at the end of his life almost. He is almost vanquished, but actually they prevail over Baal. And Verga is laying on the ground, wondering if he should even continue because of what we mentioned about him as a character being weak, old, guilt-ridden, all that stuff. And then he hears these voices and decides he must go on to fight Baal's disciples and raises his hand so the rescue chopper can get to him. On the surface, seems fine. Maybe it's the motivation. Now that I've talked it out, maybe it's the motivation part. So him raising his hand to be rescued so he can fight another day, I don't know.
So, right. I think it's good that you came to that conclusion because I think that that's it, right? What's his motivation? First off. Secondly, I was fine with the helicopter, even though it seems like it's out of nowhere because there's no sort of trace. Like he's not wearing some sort of tracker. What are they doing there? Okay, you know what? That's how you want to end the book? Great.
I'll counter that with one tiny point. I was okay with the helicopter coming out of nowhere because there's a freaking fight going on. Baal is now being tracked. Somebody's tracking him. Not everybody's as crazy as his worshippers. So it didn't seem like a Deus Ex Machina to me. It seemed like because people knew Baal had left and people were tracking somebody, and then the Eskimo village that got destroyed, I'm sure in the background, and this is me inserting events, using my imagination, I'm sure in the background Michael knows people, and Verga probably called somebody and said, hey, I'm going to Iceland. So the fact that a helicopter came out of nowhere, that's fine. I didn't even notice it until you brought it up that it was out of nowhere. But for me, the motivation of Verga, I think that carried with me throughout the book. And at the end, when he's like, yes, I must fight the disciples, rescue me. You're like, okay.
Well, what does he have to live for? Right? We don't know. We don't know what he has to live for.
Yeah.
Except to fight the disciples. And, like, if he wants to become a Batman character, like, okay, fine.
Yeah.
I don't care. But the book is supposed to have more supernatural elements, and it's like, okay, it's fine. The fight at the end was nice, but it should have been longer. Maybe longer is the wrong word. Because I'm like thinking through your thoughts on the motivations, and it's like, because I don't know Michael's motivations. I don't know Verga's motivation. It's just like, okay, this Messiah character who is, got these worshippers and convincing people that to join his cult, fine. But like, oh, maybe this is it. I don't even know what Baal wants. Like, yeah, he has his monologue against Jehovah, but like, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but like, what does he want? What does he really want? Well, this power wants destruction, and like, sure. I mean, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
It feels a little plateauy. Is that just me?
No, it's not just you. Just like with the helicopter comment, this is another one that I didn't think about until you mentioned it. We don't get a lot of Baal's motivations. Now, I'm willing to forgive that more than I am Verga and Michael because Baal is a demon whose motivation is to destroy humanity because demons hate God's creation. And in the book, he is mad at the Jews because old Israel, ancient Israel, had usurped him, well, not usurped him, have toppled him from power. Because when the Canaanites were destroyed, most of Baal worship, the way he knew it, this particular demon, went by the wayside. So he's back, supposedly after 3,000 years, to wreak havoc on the Jews. But even that's a little bit, lean, because you have him orchestrating this thing in Kuwait, this massive demonic tent revival, to set up a Jewish reporter to shoot him, but not him, to fake his death, to bring about this Middle East fervor and hatred and focus it against modern-day Israel. So that was his thing. I'm like, I get it. And I think he did a wonderful job, McCammon, with the demon-hating Jews, the demon-hating Christ and, Yahweh. That was all done well. And maybe they could have been more. Maybe there could have been less. But the fact that Baal, as a demon, has this hatred for the God of creation and the people of the book and the Jews and Jesus specifically, I thought that was well done. But is that his motivation to destroy the Jews?
And then if so, why? I mean, I understand your point about actioners. And this is why I think that I have trouble with pop fiction and pop horror, like pop anything, is I want to go on a journey as the audience that gives me the highs and lows, but it needs to be satisfactory. And frankly, like to quote again, the $1 Million Outlines book did you finish that?
No, I haven't had a chance to.
Okay.
But I'm reading it currently, yeah.
Yeah. Is we as the audience want a specific type of story because frankly, that's what we've grown up with. And it's the story of 1,000 ages. The hero's journey, you don't have to follow it perfectly, but the story of the hero's journey is a good story for a reason, and we resonate with it. I'm not saying don't ever try additional story types, because that's the only way that we'll find new ways to tell the hero's journey, I think.
Yeah.
But this is the power of revision. I think that we have done any kid or person or human who wants to be a writer a disservice by not imploring that revision is where books are strengthened, and having beta readers makes your book stronger. You don't have to write the first draft and go, well, that's the book, and do no changes. You need people like you and me, not specifically you and me, but like-minded folks who are like, hey, I want you to have the best flippin' book possible. Let me tell you where I feel bored. Let me tell you where I feel questions of unresolved notice for the characters. Let me tell you. And then you as the author go, oh, interesting. Okay, I guess I could see that. Let me think about how to fix that.
Right.
And then you make it better, which is why, and you can rag on me all you want, whoever, but like Sanderson has done he's created a new model where he has beta readers. He has people who are in the military reading his books, and he goes, hey, is this normal for like a soldier like Kaladin who has depression and PTSD? Hey, psychologist, is this normal for Shallan to hear voices in this way? Hey, is it normal for someone in a wheelchair to act this way to someone in a wheelchair? He uses that specific data to go, oh, okay, I didn't write the journey that way. He used his wife to go, hey, is this how women engage with this specific scenario? And he uses that, and then he's still the author.
Yeah.
I mean, you could go talk to Charles Manson or something like that and get cult leader vibes. So this book is a little different, but so I'm talking about like authors, right. Authors in general, I don't know. I'm just brandishing on with my silver tongue, so.
That's on point. I think revision is a good thing. There's conversations I've heard authors have about how they write. Do they start with an outline, or do they start with a premise? Do they build the outline around a premise or a plot? Do they create a plot and write backstories for each character, so then when they're writing the character in their head, it makes sense for them why Shallan is kicking a kid in a wheelchair, whatever. But the one thing that they've all mentioned is you always want to rewrite. You always want to edit. You always want to listen to your editor. If they're not talking about beta readers, if they're not extensively reworking their works, if they're not doing that deep of an analysis as Sanderson, they're at least going, hey, editor, help me out. And they listen to their editor.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Now, before we go, I want to bring up a really light topic. Sex in the book. Power, specifically from the quote that McCammon said. Can you read that quote again where he wrote this book from a state of powerlessness?
Baal is my angry young man novel. It is also my first published novel and the first book I ever tried to write. I think that in Baal, you can feel the friction of shoulders being squeezed by iron walls. My shoulders pressing against the walls of a dead-end job. Baal is about power, written at a time when I had none. I was 25 years old when I wrote Baal and working at a department store in my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. My job was ferrying advertising proofs between the local newspaper and the various department heads. Traffic control, they called it. When I went home at night, I sat down at my old Royal typewriter, long since deceased, and worked on a novel that would become Baal.
Right. So, to me, I find it curious that McCammon wanted to write about feeling powerless. This is his outlet for it. Baal and his rise to power that aligns with the way that he was feeling. What I don't understand, I have my speculations, but I'd be curious where you sit with this, is how McCammon decided that sex was an outlet for power, because we see it come up a couple times in the book. First is the attack in the front end of the book where the woman is assaulted on the street and raped. Second is the orgy.
Even before that, where young Baal ravishes a nun.
Oh, that was second. You're right. So it's his mother, Baal's mother, the nun, then the orgy, and then finally the Eskimo woman, where she's offered. It doesn't happen, but she's offered.
Yes.
And so these are 4 instances where he uses sex in a book that he was writing from a place of powerlessness. And I'm not trying to read into his love life, but there's a psychologist somewhere who said that sex isn't about love or intimacy, it's about power. Do you vaguely recall this quote through the years?
Yeah, I think so.
But it might have been related to serial killers.
Okay. Maybe. Are you talking about Kaufman?
That sounds right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. What does she say?
Well, she has a book. It's actually with another woman, Kaufman and Pulwitz. They have a chapter in a Cambridge University book on sex. When sex is power, gender roles in sex and their consequences. I did a quick Google search. Oscar Wilde. You're thinking about Oscar Wilde. Everything in the world is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. Oscar Wilde. They have that in the opening chapter.
Oh, that might be it. I knew it was like a famous quote, but that could be it too. Anywho, I don't really have a direction here outside of like, it's interesting that someone who feels powerless uses plot points with sex to communicate power. Now, let's look for a second. So like Baal's mother, she's powerless and sex happens. The nun is powerless and sex happens.
Naughton.
I want to call him James again.
Naughton.
I don't know why I want to call him James. Naughton
He's powerless.
is overtaken and sex happens. The 4th time with the shaman who's being offered the woman, she's powerless and sex doesn't happen.
No, sex happens.
Well, not with him. Not with him.
They have sex.
He offers her, am I misremembering the plot point? He offers her to the guests.
Yep, you're misremembering. That's because he's being a crude bastard. The husband of the woman brings her to him,
right?
And they end up having sex. But he does offer her to the Michael and Virga. They don't engage in the orgy there that could have been, but he ends up having sex with her.
Okay, I guess the thing that sticks out to me then is the offering, because he's like, yeah, they do this all the time. You want her?
Yeah,
and then, like, that part sticks out to me, right?
Right, no, and it should, because it's
because the power, because I'm thinking about the power aspect.
Yeah. I don't think it takes away from your point. I'm just saying that Zark ends up having sex with the woman anyway.
Sure, correction. Yeah.
So sex happens. It's just not between Virga and the Eskimo woman.
Right. This theme stood out to me, and it's, a theme because it's a book written by a person who felt powerless, and he was writing about the rise of power, and one of the channels and conduits he used to explain the rise of power and feeling powerless was sex. So, I don't know, what do you think about sex and power?
Well, sex serves a myriad of purposes, right? It's not just fun time in the sack, although it can be. And it oftentimes is. No matter what the purpose, it's fun and great. Sex is wonderful. But it's an expression of love. It's an expression of intimacy. As you go down the scale, it could be lust, and it could turn into addiction and maybe even a unhealthy expression of love as you get past just your average thing that we would call lust. It provides pleasure. It helps people's identities because people feel powerful when they can conquer the opposite sex, or even people for the same sex. The principles at work are the same. But I think when we're talking about power, it's usually in a negative expression. When sex is used as power or used from a position of power, like the rape in the beginning of the book, the rape of the nun, the violent orgy. The first two are definitely expressions of power on the end of the abuser, the rapist, the evil homeless demon thing, and then Baal. So those are people with power exercising it in an abusive way. But for the Eskimo woman, it's not as negative as that, but it's still not in any sense romantic or beautiful because it's a social obligation. If her husband can't provide for her, a son or daughter, she must go have sex with a shaman. When sex is used as an expression of power, or power is used to garner sex, to exploit somebody sexually, and the last one's obviously negative, but the former is not always as clear, but once you peel back the onion, it's obviously negative. So when power is connected to sex, there's usually abuse involved. And that's clear in the book. Now, none of the sexual encounters that you mentioned are full of love,
They're
intimacy.
not painted in a good light. No. And
No.
you're reading this book as like, this is a horror book. This is a cult.
Yeah.
We get it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope that made sense because you kind of put me on the spot. I wasn't expecting to talk about sex and power.
Right. It's there. And this is one of the things that I enjoy about this podcast is we read books and authors write books. And sometimes authors, like, frankly, I don't think McCammon planned this. I think he's just like, oh, then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Like, sure, minor planning, whatever, but I don't think it was premeditated. Like, I can't wait to have 4 moments in the book where sex happened, right? Like, that doesn't strike me as his style. As someone who's writing fluidly in a personal state of being where he feels powerless, that's what came out. And so that provokes me to questions that go, interesting, right? He's associating 2 humans coming together, and he's using it as a conduit to express his powerlessness. And I don't really have a main point here outside of the fact that I think it's interesting and we should pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too.
As a society.
Yeah, he would have known about the Oscar Wilde quote probably as a writer or somebody who's into literature. And he's writing this in the 80s, so this is 87. Things are changing for men and women in the workforce and society in general. Women have even more autonomy when it comes to sex and their place in society in the 80s. So and I don't know, this is me speculating. I don't know if he's observing that, incorporating that into his book, but that's part of his experience. And what he did with it, we can't know because we're not him and we weren't there when he wrote it. But the 80s had its own, each decade since the sexual revolution of the 60s in America, and this is a very watered down, simplified version, I get it. Each decade had its own little jump when it came to sex, positive, negative, and neutral. It had little jumps, if you will, and then it plateaued. And the next decade, people looked back and went like, well, no, this is the next step we should take in our evolution, if you will. So whatever was going on when he wrote this between 85 and 87, 82 and 87, where I don't forget how long it took him to write this book, I'm sure he was processing it. You and I, when we discuss this book, we are viewing it with information we have around us.
Mm-hmm.
I looked up Sex is Power, and the book that came up was this book by the 2 women that I mentioned, whose names I already forgot because I closed the tab. I'm sure they're older than us, and so they probably maybe were young women or like in their 20s during the 80s. So that informs how they will come to write this academic book. You can't escape that. It's interesting to think about. A lot of rabbit holes to go down.
Yeah. Well, I suppose we'll leave you with that. Is when you see books that authors communicate the state that they were in when they wrote them, and then you read the book and you go, well, I know the state of the author and his mindset, and I know the feeling he had. I know what this book is talking about theme-wise. You can look at things and go, interesting. Why is he using his powerless feeling of himself? He's using a conduit to write about the opposite of like what that could look like. And then one of the tactile plot points that he uses is sex. This is how you would, I would say, critically dissect a book as a primer of sorts. It's certainly convoluted because I brought it up last minute, didn't talk to Slava about it beforehand, but it did stand out to me to go, okay, what's he trying to say here? Exactly to Slava's point. What was going on in society? How was he feeling? And we only have snippets. And humans are deeply complex beings. And oftentimes we don't always know the motivations for why we do things. it's fun to speculate and mentally dissect what that could be.
For sure. An apt ending to this episode, because I think it sets us up for the conversation with Zubair.
Oh, man, looking forward to that.
Discuss Baal as the historical Baal, and then seeing how that relates to the book, how it doesn't relate to the book, what McCammon got right, what McCammon got wrong about his theological perspectives.
And from a Catholic point of view. From Zubair. Love that. All right, well, thank you for tuning in to SideQuest. Be sure to take a moment, rate the show on your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your book-loving friends. See you next time on SideQuest.